I remember the first time I saw him clear as day. He was just a boy, really, though his skin had a way of making him look ancient, like a tree that had stood through 100 winters. I hold this little bird carving in my hand now, smooth where my thumb has worn it over the years. It reminds me of how small he must have felt under all those eyes, a fragile thing trapped in a hard shell. The air in that canvas tent was thick, I reckon, with the smell of damp sawdust and unwashed people. It was early autumn, the kind of day where the sun was still strong, but a chill waited just around the corner. Elias, they called him, stood on a low wooden platform. A rough velvet rope, faded and worn, kept the folks from getting too close, though it didn't stop their staring. They pressed in, elbow to elbow, their faces lit by the flickering gas lamps that burned even in the daytime, trying to make them out in the gloom. His skin, the Lord's truth, was just like bark, hard and rough, with ridges and deep lines, the color of old oak. It wasn't a thing to be gawked at, but that was just how life was for some folks then, if you had an affliction. The barker, a man with a booming voice and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, would shout about the petrified man, a wonder of nature, a living testament to time itself. He called it artistry, but it was just Elias, standing there, breathing. I traced the little eye of this carved bird with my fingertip. It feels so quiet, so still in my palm. But Elias, he wasn't still on the inside. He stood there, yes, but his own eyes, dark and deep, were always moving. Not in fear, not in shame, but watching. He watched the way the crowd shifted, like a slow-moving river. He saw how their eyes jumped from his hands to his face, then back again, always looking for the oddest part, the thing that made him different. He was learning even then the rhythm of their attention, the places their gaze would linger and the places it would skip right over. It was a silent study, but it was happening right there in that dusty tent. They paid to stare, but he watched them back, taking their measure. How does a man live when his very body is his prison and his audience his jailer? The circus rolled on, I reckon, and the name of the petrified man started to spread like wildfire through the towns. Folks would talk about it, whispering of the wonder, or sometimes the affliction. It was just a few months after Elias first stood in that tent, but already the crowds were bigger, and their eyes, they were sharper, colder. They weren't just curious anymore. They wanted to know. And with that knowing came the scholars, Dr. Finch. He was the worst of them. A man with spectacles perched on his nose and a mind like a steel trap. He'd come into Elias's tent with his assistants, not to see the show, but to see the subject. The damp sawdust on the floor would cling to their polished boots, but they paid it no mind. Their gaze was only for Elias, for the bark on his skin. Dr. Finch carried a well-bound leather notebook, thick with pages already filled with precise cramped script. He'd flip through it, making notes, asking Elias questions that weren't really questions, just ways to gather more facts for his ledger. He had a set of cold brass calipers like something a carpenter would use, but he used them to measure Elias's fingers, his arms, the very curve of his back. Each number was jotted down, each observation a nail hammered into Elias's own self. He wasn't a man to them. He was a collection of data, a strange drawing in a medical journal waiting to be finished. Elias just stood there, quiet, letting them do their work. But he wasn't idle. He watched how Dr. Finch moved, how his eyes always went straight to the skin. Never to the man behind it. He saw how the assistants, they just copied the doctor, seeing only what he pointed out. Their intent was so fixed, so narrow. Lord, the way. Those doctors looked at him like he was a beetle pinned to a board. They didn't see the man, just the bark. This little bird here, it's got such a delicate wing carved so fine. Elias, he had hands like that too, hidden beneath the ruff. They never knew. Elias saw how they missed the way his breath hitched sometimes, or the slight tremble in his hand when a cold caliper touched his cheek. They were too busy measuring the bark to notice the man who lived beneath it. He started to understand that their own expectation, their own scientific purpose, made them blind to anything else. They only looked for what they already believed to be there, a specimen, not a soul. It was a strange kind of lesson, learning how to be invisible right in front of the very folks who paid to stare. Can a man be truly free when his very identity is written down in a book, owned by another's pen? That Dr. Finch, he put Elias down on paper, made him a thing for all the world to read about. I can still hear the crackle of those fresh pages in my mind. This little bird, it feels so real, so alive in my hand. But those words, they tried to make Elias something dead and cataloged. The whale oil lamp flickered low in the circus owner's wagon office, casting long, dancing shadows that swallowed the corners. It was late, past the time when even the most stubborn roustabouts were asleep, and the only sound was the groan of the old wagon settling and the sharp, crisp rustle of paper. The owner, a man named Mr. Silas, sat hunched over a new medical journal, his spectacles perched on his nose, reading under the dim light. Elias was there too, quiet as a shadow himself, though the rough bark of his skin was hard to miss even in the gloom. He was mending a tear in a canvas backdrop, his fingers, despite their rough covering, working with a surprising gentleness. Mr. Silas would often keep him about, even late, claiming Elias needed to earn his keep beyond the exhibit tent. Elias didn't much mind, for it gave him a chance to see things, to hear things that the crowds never would. Mr. Silas let out a grunt, a sound of satisfaction, and tapped a page in the journal with a thick finger. "Listen to this, boy," he said, not looking up. "Dr. Finch, he calls you a singular marvel of epidermal ossification. Says your integumentary system presents an unparalleled opportunity for anatomical study." He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Opportunity indeed." Elias didn't say a word, just kept his needle moving, but he listened to every syllable. He heard the way Mr. Silas spoke the words, not like they described a man, but like they described a rare coin or a strange rock pulled from the ground. The journal, he reckoned, made him famous, but it also made him less than human in the eyes of the learned men who would read it. They weren't seeing Elias, the boy who could mend canvas or carve a bird from wood. They were seeing the petrified man, a collection of scientific terms. He watched Mr. Silas smooth the pages, the paper so clean and new, full of drawings and careful descriptions of his own skin. It was all laid out, his affliction, his very being, written down for anyone with a shilling to buy the journal and stare. And Elias, he started to understand that these words, these fine descriptions, they built a cage around him just as surely as any iron bar. They told people what to expect, what to see, even before they laid eyes on him in his tent. And that, he figured, was a kind of power, if a man knew how to use it. How can a man escape a cage built not of iron, but of words printed in a scholar's book? The sun beat down hard on the rickety table, right outside the main tent, making the dust motes dance in the harsh light. Mr. Silas, the circus owner, sat hunched over, his face already slick with sweat, but his eyes were sharp and dry. Before Elias, he pushed a piece of parchment, thick and yellowed like an old hide. It had a way of rustling, even when no breeze stirred, like dry leaves. "This here," Mr. Silas said, his voice flat as a plank, "is the new understanding. For your future, Elias. For ours." Elias just stood there, letting the sun bake his bark-like skin. He watched Mr. Silas's finger trace the lines of the paper. He watched the roustabouts moving wagons in the distance, their movements quick and practiced, their faces plain and unremarked. He saw the crowds gathering already, their eyes eager for the spectacle, but never truly seeing the people who made it. They saw the painted canvas, the loud barker, the strange things they paid to stare at. The paper lay there, heavy with its official wax seal, red as dried blood. It spelled out his wages, small as a sparrow's song. It spelled out his duties, every day of every year. It spelled out that his body, his very presence, belonged to the circus, for as long as the paper said. It was a cage of words, I reckon, built of ink and promises, tighter than any iron bar. Elias, he looked at that paper and then he looked past it. He watched a clown off duty, wiping his grease paint with a rag, his face returning to plainness. He watched a stable hand mucking out a stall, his back bent, his presence as common as the dirt. He saw how easily they faded into the background, how the eye just slid over them, looking for something grander. He started to understand that the world had a way of overlooking the ordinary, even when it was right in front of its nose. It was a strange thought, but it took root deep down in him. What hidden corner of himself can a man keep when every part of him is owned and cataloged? The midway, just before the evening show, was a place of frantic motion. Wagons groaned, their heavy wooden wheels rattling over the hard-packed dirt, leaving deep ruts. Canvas tents flapped like restless ghosts, and the air hung thick with the smell of damp sawdust, stale popcorn, and the faint sweet scent of elephant. Barkers, their voices already hoarse, practiced their pitches, each one a master of making folks look one way while their hands did something else entirely. Elias, he watched them from the shadows, a quiet shadow himself. He'd stand by the peeling paint of a candy booth, or near the ropes where the roustabouts wrestled with the big top poles. He wasn't just looking anymore, he was seeing. He saw how the barker's loud voice pulled the gaze of the crowd, drawing their eyes to the painted canvas, to the exaggerated signs, while his quick fingers palmed a coin or adjusted a prop. He saw how the roustabouts, grimy and tired, moved with a certain slumped shoulder, a particular way of dragging their feet, as if the weight of the world was always on them. No one ever truly looked at them. Not really. They were just part of the backdrop, part of the machinery. I reckon that's when the seed of his idea truly took root, seeing how easily eyes could be fooled, how folks only saw what they expected to see. It's a strange thing, the human mind, always filling in the blanks with what it already knows. Elias, he started to understand that. He saw how the crowd, they came to see a wonder, a spectacle. They came to see him, the petrified man, but they didn't come to see a common man, a roustabout, a shadow in the setting sun. He started to try it, just small things at first. He'd walk amongst the setup crew, his shoulders hunched a bit more, his gaze lowered. He'd mimic the slow, heavy gait of a man who'd been hauling canvas all day, the way they'd wipe a hand across their brow even when it wasn't hot. He'd let his unique skin, usually his curse, become part of the rough texture of the background like bark on an old tree, just another part of the dusty, worn-out circus grounds. He was testing the water, you see, learning how to be nothing special, how to be overlooked. It was a kind of freedom, just to walk and not be stared at, to melt into the noise. If eyes can be tricked by a painted backdrop, what else can they be made to miss? He'd hide away in the shadows of the wagon train, just watching, learning. Even in the dead of night, the circus breathed. You could hear the elephants shift their weight, the horses snuffle in their stalls, the distant rumble of a wagon wheel getting fixed. Elias, he knew those sounds. He knew how to move when they were loud, and how to freeze when they fell quiet. It was in a little forgotten corner behind the big animal tents, where the lantern light barely reached. There, he'd find coarse canvas scraps, left behind by the roustabouts. He'd sit on a dusty crate, his fingers so rough from his skin, working a sewing needle with a slow, careful hand. He wasn't sewing pretty things, mind you. He was shaping. He was learning how to make a body disappear, not by magic, but by tricking the eye. He'd cut and stitch, trying to make the canvas hang just so, to break up the shape of a man. Lord, it's a strange thing, what a man will do to just be left alone. He wasn't trying to be someone else, not exactly. He was trying to be no one, just another shadow, another piece of the ordinary clutter that folks never truly bothered to see. He'd drape a big, loose coat or a wide-brimmed hat, trying to soften the hard lines of him, to make his shoulders slump just like a tired stable hand. He'd practice moving like them, too, with heavy, slow steps, not the quick, nervous movements of a man on display. He risked discovery every time he lit that dim lantern, every time the needle caught the light. If Mr. Silas, the owner, or one of his men had found him, well, there's no telling what fresh punishment they'd have dreamed up. They might have chained him closer, or put another guard on him. They wanted him to stay exactly as they'd written him down, a specimen, a wonder, not a man with thoughts of his own, or hands that could shape cloth. But Elias, he knew the secret, was in being unremarkable, in adopting the posture of a man who had no story worth telling, no face worth remembering. He was learning to meld into the crowd, unseen and uncatalogued by those who sought to define him. How much of a man's identity is truly his own, and how much is merely what others expect to see. It was a particular kind of morning, I reckon, the kind where the air still held the chill of night, but the sun was trying its best to burn through. The circus grounds, they were a commotion of men and beasts getting ready for another day of showing off. Wagons rattled over the hard-packed dirt, and the smell of damp sawdust mixed with the sharp scent of horse manure, thick as a blanket over everything. It was in this busy mess that Elias first truly learned to disappear. He moved like a man with a purpose, but no special one. He'd put on clothes like any roustabout, old canvas trousers and a shirt that had seen too many washes. His feet, tucked into a pair of worn leather boots, knew how to scuff and shuffle just right. He kept his head down, not like a defeated man, but like a man focused on the ground, on the task at hand, whatever that task might be. His eyes would dart, seeing everything, but never settling, never inviting a gaze back. He was just another shadow among the moving parts of the circus machine. Lord, it's been so long since I felt that kind of freedom, just to walk unseen. My old bones ache sometimes, just from sitting here by the fire. And I reckon I know a bit of what Elias felt, moving through that crowd, a ghost in his own skin. The lamp oil smells strong tonight, a comfort in its way, but it makes me think of all the dim, hidden corners Elias had to learn to navigate. He wasn't trying to hide, not exactly. That was the trick of it. He was just unremarkable. He'd carry a coil of rope, or pretend to tighten a wagon wheel, or stand by a tent pole, looking as if he were waiting for an order. The barkers, they were too, busy shouting their lies. The vendors, they were counting their pennies. The men setting up the animal cages, they had heavy work to do. No one saw Elias. They saw a shape, a presence, but never him. He learned to make his body speak the language of nothing special, and the world, it listened. He walked past the men who had measured him, the men who had written him down in their books. He even walked past the owner, Mr. Silas, who was barking orders near the main tent, his voice like a whip. Elias was so close he could have reached out and touched the man's coat, but Mr. Silas just looked right through him, seeing only the backdrop of his circus, not the man who was learning to slip right out of his grasp. It was a sweet taste, that anonymity, like cool water after a long thirst. But it was a bitter taste, too, because it showed him just how much he longed for a life where he didn't have to pretend to be nothing at all. What freedom can be found in being utterly forgotten by the world that seeks to define you? It was of an evening after the last of the crowds had shuffled out, their pockets lighter and their heads filled with sights. Elias, he had learned the rhythm of the circus at night, the way the shadows stretched long and thin, and how a man could melt right into them if he knew how to move. He had spent weeks watching the roustabouts, the stable hands, the folk who just seemed to drift from one chore to the next, without a soul truly seeing them. He carried that knowledge in his bones now, a quiet sort of understanding. This night he was trying it for real, beyond the main tents, out where the wagons were parked for the long haul. The air was cool and carried the smell of damp sawdust mixed with horse manure, a familiar scent that had been his world for so long. He moved like a shadow himself, along the very edge of the grounds, where the dim light from a distant cook fire barely touched. His clothes were plain, just some rough canvas and dull wool, the kind any man might wear, and he kept his head down, his gait slow and even, as if he had no particular place to be, just heading towards a task. He was nearing the boundary, a dirt road that wound off into the darkness, a promise of something beyond the canvas walls. He could almost taste the freedom of it, the quiet world beyond the barker's shouts and the staring eyes. But then a sound, sharp and sudden, cut through the night. It was the scrape of heavy boots on the gravel and a cough. Elias froze, not like a deer, but like a piece of the night itself, blending with a stack of old lumber near a wagon wheel. A figure emerged from the deeper shadows, a guard making his rounds. The man carried a lantern, its flame flickering low, casting long, dancing shadows that made the familiar world look strange and new. Elias held his breath, every muscle in him still as stone. The guard paused, fiddling with a cold iron cage lock on a nearby animal wagon, making sure it was secure. The metal clinked, a sound that seemed to echo too loud in the quiet air. Elias watched, his heart thudding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had come so close, but one wrong move, one glance from that guard, and it would all be for naught. Lord, it's a funny thing how a man can crave a simple walk down a road more than all the gold in the world. To be unseen, unjudged, uncatalogued. It's a powerful hunger, that one. The guard grunted, satisfied with the lock, and then with a sharp puff, he lowered the lantern to the ground and snuffed out the flame. The sudden darkness was absolute. A heavy blanket pulled over the world, but not before Elias saw the guard turn his head, just a fraction, towards where Elias was hidden. Did he see him? Did he feel a ripple in the night air? Elias didn't know. He stayed absolutely still, not even the smallest shift of weight, until the sound of the guard's boots faded into the distance. It was a close call, too close, and it taught Elias that blending wasn't just about looking like a nobody. It was about moving with the expected lack of intent, avoiding any action that drew attention, no matter how subtle. How much risk is a man willing to take for a whisper of freedom, and what happens when that whisper almost becomes a shout? The very next morning after Elias had tried his luck in the dark, the circus owners showed their teeth. They knew something was amiss, even if they couldn't rightly say what. That canvas tent where Elias stayed, it got itself some new iron. Heavy chain links they were, draped all around the posts, clinking low in the morning breeze. And a new guard, a big quiet fellow with eyes that didn't miss much, took to standing outside, watching the dust settle. It was a cage within a cage, I reckon, meant to break a man's spirit if the first one hadn't already. Then came the doctors again. Lord, they always came back. They brought their cold plaster and their measuring tapes and their quiet, pointed questions. They wanted more molds of Elias, you see, more records of his skin, like he was just a lump of clay for their books, like his body was theirs to own, to chart, and to name, and not his own to keep. It's a cruel thing to be made into a thing, to have your very breath owned by another's ledger, and your skin put down in a book for all the world to read as if you were just a rock. Elias, he watched it all happen. He felt the cold plaster on his arm again, heard the heavy clink of those new chains, and a new understanding settled in him, heavy as a stone in a deep well. He knew then that looking like a nobody wasn't enough. He had to be a nobody, truly. He had to learn to make his shoulders slump just so, let his eyes hold no spark of defiance, no flicker of a dream. He had to learn to sit still like an old stump, with no ambition, no particular thought stirring in his head. Even when he was alone, he practiced it, that slow, quiet fading. It was a harder act than any clown could ever manage, to make himself truly empty, truly resigned, a man with no secrets, no plans, no hope. Because if they saw even a flicker of it, they would find a way to snuff it out. When the very act of living becomes a crime, how does a man keep hope from turning to ash? It was the main tent, all right, lit up so bright you could see every speck of dust dancing in the air. The gas lamps hissed and shimmered, making everything look stark, like a picture drawn with a hard black pencil. And the crowd, Lord, they were packed in tight, a mix of folks in their Sunday best, and those stiff-collared scholars, all come to stare at Elias. They had him on a raised platform, a kind of pedestal, like he was a statue carved from a strange dark wood. He stood there, still as a winter tree, while Dr. Finch, that same cold man with his measuring tools, moved around him. Finch wore gloves, white as bone, and he pressed them against Elias's skin, tracing the rough, bark-like growths with a careful, distant touch. He spoke to the crowd in a low, rumbling voice, using big words that made Elias sound like a thing, a curiosity pulled from the earth, not a living soul. Then came the flash. A man with a big, boxy camera, a heavy sheet draped over his head, popped a bit of powder. It sparked and flared, bright as lightning, freezing Elias right there in that moment of being poked and prodded, his face a mask of quiet endurance. The smell of burnt magnesium hung in the air, sharp and bitter. The crowd murmured, some with pity, some with a kind of hungry wonder. They saw the petrified man, just like the posters said. They saw the science, the strange affliction. They didn't see the boy, the man, trapped inside that shell. It was a hard thing to witness, to know a man was being laid bare like that, his every curve and crevice measured and discussed, all for the price of a ticket. It felt like they were peeling him open piece by piece, not with a knife, but with their eyes, their whispers, and those cold, gloved hands. Elias, he just stood there, breathing slow, letting it all wash over him. But even then, I reckon, even in that low moment, his eyes were moving. He was watching the scholars, how their gaze was fixed on the oddness, the parts they could write down. He watched the gawkers, how their attention wandered, how quickly they grew bored once the first shock wore off. He saw how easily folks missed what was right in front of them, if it wasn't what they were told to see. My old bones ached just thinking on it, the way they made him feel less than human. It's a bitter truth. How easy it is for some to take hold of another story and make it their own, for their own gain. When every ounce of dignity is stripped away, what remains for a man to fight for, and how can he possibly win? He worked on that new way of seeing, Elias did, after they put him on display like a side of beef for those city folks and their cameras. He didn't just look, he studied. He learned the way a man could stand just so, in the shadows of a tent pole, and nobody would pay him mind. He saw how the roustabouts moved, their backs bent to the work, their eyes on the ground, and how that made them invisible to the fine ladies and gentlemen who came to stare. Over weeks, he started to move like them too, not all at once, mind you, but slow, a little at a time. Of an early morning, when the fog still hung heavy and the air smelled of damp canvas and horse, Elias would slip from his exhibit. The new guard, he was a lazy sort, half asleep with his lantern flickering low. Elias would just melt into the waking circus, a shadow among shadows. He picked up a broom, a worn thing with bristles splayed wide, and he'd sweep, just sweep the dust and stray straw, like he'd been doing it his whole life. He didn't try to hide his skin, not really. He just made it part of the scenery, the rough fabric of a canvas apron, stained with grease and dirt. It had a way of breaking up his shape. He'd keep his head down, his gaze fixed on the ground, like a man whose thoughts were only on the next sweep of the broom. He learned the dull thud a broom made against the packed earth, a sound so common it was just noise, not a thing to notice. He learned to walk with the slight limp of a man who worked hard, his shoulders slumped just so. The circus was a mighty machine, loud and full of distractions. And Elias, he learned to be the quiet cog that nobody ever saw turning. He'd carry water buckets, heavy and sloshing, from the well to the animal tents, feeling the ache in his arms, but not the eyes of the onlookers. He'd help stack folded chairs, the wood rough against his bark-like hands, and the men he worked alongside. They'd just grunt a greeting, never truly looking at him. They saw a pair of hands, a body doing a chore, not the petrified man. It was a strange kind of freedom, I reckon, to be so close to the cage, yet to walk outside it unseen. He was still owned, still a specimen in their books and their minds, but in those quiet hours, he was just another working man. And the folks who paid good money to see him later in the day, they walked right past him without a flicker of recognition. It showed him how blind folks could be when they weren't expecting to see anything but what they paid for. A man might wonder, how long can a man walk hidden in plain sight before the world forgets he was ever there at all? The wind, it had a way of whispering secrets through the canvas that night, making the big tents flap like tired wings. It was a few years after they started poking and prodding Elias, after they tried to write him into a book and lock him away in words. Now the circus was packing up, the whole thing a mess of ropes and poles and weary men. The moon, it hid its face, leaving the grounds dark as the inside of a well. Elias, he knew this kind of darkness. He knew the way the shadows stretched and swallowed things whole. He had practiced for this, Lord, he had. He'd learned to move like the dust, to blend like a knot in old wood. He wore the rough, faded clothes of a roustabout, the kind nobody ever looked at twice. His posture, it was just so, tired, like any other man who'd spent a season hauling and lifting. He didn't hurry, didn't lag, just moved with the rhythm of the breaking down show, a ghost in plain sight. I reckon that's the hardest trick, ain't it? To be seen but not noticed. To be there, but not there. I can still feel the smooth wood of this little bird in my hand, the way my thumb has worn it down over the years. This bird, it's got a small chip on its wing where it must have fallen once. Just like Elias, he stumbled, but he never truly fell. I trace that chip now, thinking of the journey it took and the man who carved it. The wagons creaked and groaned as they were loaded, their heavy wooden wheels rattling on the frozen ground. The smell of damp sawdust and horse manure hung thick in the air, mixing with the sharp tang of lantern oil. Men shouted orders, their voices hoarse, but no one shouted Elias's name. No one even looked his way as he picked up a loose coil of rope, carried it a piece, then set it down again, moving towards the edge of the camp. He was just another shadow among 100 others, all focused on the task at hand, eager to be done with it and move on. Dr. Finch and his kind. They were likely already gone, tucked into their warm beds, dreaming of new specimens and fresh ink. They had their books, their measurements, their grand pronouncements about the petrified man. They thought they owned him, body and soul, because they had written him down. But they didn't own the quiet mind that watched them, the steady hand that learned their blind spots. They didn't own the man who was walking, slow and steady, right out from under their noses. He walked past the last tent, a canvas flap still half tied down, whipping in the wind. The distant sound of a train whistle cut through the night, a lonesome, hopeful sound. It was a promise of somewhere else, a place where a man could just be a man, not a marvel, not a specimen. Elias didn't look back. He just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, each step taking him further from the cage that had been his life. The circus, it was a machine of reputation, all noise and spectacle, but he had found the quiet crack in its gears. He just kept moving until the sounds of the circus faded to a whisper, then to nothing at all. The wind had picked up, carrying away the last whispers of his name, leaving only the legend of the petrified man for those who cared to remember. But the man himself, he was gone. He was free. I close my eyes now, holding this little bird so tight in my old gnarled hand. It feels so smooth, so worn, just like a good memory. That night, Elias, he didn't fly away like a bird. He just walked, quiet as a deer in the woods. He left behind the bark-skinned man they thought they knew, and he became no one, which was everything. He became just a man walking on a dark road under a moonless sky. How does a man, once a spectacle, truly vanish from the world that owned him, leaving behind only a legend